Welcome to the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. My name's Calum, Lykan, and I'm your host. Well, this is the second episode of the podcast, and as promised, we're going to have an interview, well, more of a conversation with Kristin Pedemonti, a wonderful storyteller from America. Today's episode of the Bothy Storytelling Podcast is sponsored by myself, Calum Lykan Storytelling and Tours, www.calumlykanstorytelling.com. So, as promised, we're going to have a conversation with Kristin Pedemonti, and the reason it's a conversation and not an interview, well, me and Kristin met at the Weeds Cafe in Calgary, and we just started chatting, and I put on the recorder. And the idea initially was to do an interview, but we ended up chatting for well over 3 hours, and we never touched the tip of the iceberg for what we wanted to say. So I decided I would just look at the recordings and take a few snippets from what we chatted about to give you guys not an interview with Kristin, but more of a feel for this wonderful, energetic storyteller. She really is one of the most fabulous little firecrackers I've encountered in the storytelling community, full of energy and passion, and the stuff that she has done just blows my mind. She's so brave and bold and out there, traveling the world telling stories, starting literary campaigns, blowing bubbles on the subway and giving free hugs. This woman has done it all, and that's before we even mention the TED Talks, the CDs and everything else she's done. Kristin is really just a fabulous storyteller, full of energy and passion, and I hope that you can kind of get a little bit of that through the snippets that I have prepared for you. And I did mention the free hugs there. Something that Kristin is an advocate of. She just goes out everywhere with her free hug sign and gives away these hugs and just connects with people throughout the world. An incredibly brave thing to do. So here is the first little snippet of the chat, and this is her talking about her free hugs, but also talking about how it led to a TED Talk. I hope you enjoy.
TED thing, that was an audition that someone who I knew from New York City for the couch surfing community said, hey, I think you should apply for this, maybe tell them about your Belize project. And then their in parentheses was, and don't talk about that stupid free hugs crap that you do.
I think the free hugs thing is great.
And thank God I didn't listen to him.
Yeah.
Because I sent in two. I sent in one about the Belize project and just trusting and, just do it. And then I sent in one saying, so I gift bubbles on the New York City subway, and I have a free hug sign, and I hug strangers. And that was the one they chose.
Incredibly brave. Like, it is one of the most open and brave things, when someone's doing it seriously. Because I've seen them all over, and I've seen, some people do it, and it's just you can just tell they're just...
It's cutesy.
Yeah, but it's when someone's trying to do it seriously to pass on just a human connection, just a little bit of something to hopefully change someone's life, it's brilliant. And I totally agree with it. I mean, I'm not brave enough to do it, but then at the same time, there's a difference thing between you and me. If I was standing with a free hug sign, I look like a criminal.
I think you'd be surprised what would happen, because so sharing the experience, just to address that first, and I totally hear you, by the way, is one of my favorite things to do, no matter where I was traveling, because for several years, and I have my sign, I have a version of my sign that was made, so this is from Barrie, Ontario. Getting people together no matter where I was traveling, and I would put a call out no matter what city I was in and saying, do you want to come and do some free hugs with me, see what happens. And there's a guy from Montreal, total button down, 6'4", engineer, really analytical, and he said, this is so far out of my comfort zone, this terrifies me, but I want to try it. So he met me, and he was in New York City same time I was, met me in New York City, just got his sign. So just watch for a while, because even watching the act of hugging, when you see that happen, two things are happening. One, often you're witnessing joy, and joy is contagious in a good way. And the other thing is the oxytocin that is being released, that's a brain chemical. Yeah. It's a neurotransmitter. So it literally makes you feel good. That's why hugging, you feel comforted, you feel your blood pressure lowers a little bit, your immune system is boosted a little bit. So all this physiological stuff is happening, which can even happen while you're watching others. So he's watching, and about 15 minutes later, so I think I can do it. I think I can do it. So he's got his sign, and people just start accepting hugs from him, and his smile is getting bigger and bigger. He's like, oh, this is amazing. Can't believe I'm doing this. Can't believe I'm doing this. So he ends up, I don't know, a couple weeks later writing a blog post about it. And this is now 7 years later. We're still in touch on Facebook. And he still talks about how transformative it was to go through that trust process for himself, too, to say, what if I do try this? Really step outside my comfort zone. And it opened up for him to now he will more, he's more likely to interact with people. He's very introverted as well. But now he'll say, I'll be on a bus and I'll just strike up a conversation. Or he said it just removed these walls for him.
That is interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so it's really because a lot of times I've had, especially men, say to me, well, of course you can do it. You're really tiny and you're not threatening. And so we have this thought of people are going to be, they're not going to be accepting. And yet I've seen huge, my friend Andrea is 6'6".
Interesting,
Big
right.
guy. He's a teddy bear. He's just a huge teddy bear. And people just, they're like, oh my gosh, best hug I've ever had. Yeah. So it's interesting.
That's
we
nice.
step outside of our own perception. Yeah. It's all in what we're projecting to. And with the free hugs too, how that's evolved to really literally take it to places where it's really needed. There was a community of homeless under a bridge area in DC. It was kind of like an underpass. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it's been completely dismantled, and fencing has been put up, which makes me really sad. But anyway, Christmas 2014, I took my free hug sign, a huge pot of 15-bean soup, and I had a little cart with the soup, and I had little bowls, and I had bottles of water, and I had clean socks, because that's often asked for, and hand warmers. And I just walked into the tent city, and I said, is anybody home? Would anybody like some soup? Share some conversation? Would anybody like a hug? And one of the tents unzips, and this head peeks out. She's like, my name's Joy. I was like, hi, I'm Kristin. Are you hungry? She's like, yeah. So I got hot bean soup. Do you want to share? Yeah. And then the zipper opens a little farther, and she's like, this is Wayne. He's my partner. Can he have soup too? I'm like, yeah. So they unzip it farther, and then we end up having this great conversation. Unfortunately, my timing, most of the people in the tent city had gone. One of the soup kitchens is having like a big meal, so they weren't there. But we had this incredible conversation over time. And one of the first things that Joy said to me was, she said, I love documentary films. I said, oh my gosh, me too. What are some of your favorites? And we had a 20-minute conversation about documentary films. And she said, most people would not know that about me because they just see me as this homeless person. And then she started talking about the system and talking about how she was tired of just being a number, and she was caseworkers wouldn't even use numbers, that they would use our names because I'm more than a number. And so it was just, because I asked her, I said, what would you like other people to know about who you are and about what you're going through? And those were the things she shared, because I was honest. I said, I don't take pictures, I don't take video. Usually the pictures that happen with the free hugs are other people ask if they can, and then I ask to share. But I'm not a fan of, I know several people who take their cameras and like the camera's on the whole time, and to me it doesn't, that's not from the heart, and that's my personal opinion. But I did ask Joy, I said, would it be okay if I shared your story? I'd love to write a blog post about it and share your viewpoint. She said, oh my gosh, yeah, you have my permission, sure. So I try to share things that way.
So that was Kristin Pedemonti, and talking about her TED Talks and free hugs. And I thought I'd follow that up with a little story from her CD, Superhero 101. Faster than a speeding big wheel, more powerful than negative energy. Superhero 101. It's a fabulous CD that she's released of stories, and the one I'd like to play for you is Free Hugs at 12,000 feet.
I always carry my free hug sign because you never know when there might be a free hugs emergency. It's said that we need at least 4 hugs a day to maintain our sanity, and many of us are not receiving our quota. I wish I could say that I invented free hugs, that it was my idea. It's not. It's been around since about 2001. I first heard about free hugs in New York City. A couch surfer invited a bunch of us to Union Square to honor another surfer who had drowned trying to save his girlfriend in the Pacific Ocean. We all gathered in Union Square on that cold November day. It was the day after Thanksgiving. We stood in Union Square with our free hug signs overhead, and the reason we decided to do free hugs to honor this young man is because he was a photographer with a great love for people. He had a project called You Are Loved, and he would take signs that said things like, "You are loved, dear stranger, I love you. I love you just because you're you." And he would give these signs to strangers, ask them to hold them, and he would take photos of them. He had an entire website of montages of photos from all over the world. And we thought, what better way to honor this young man than to hug some people? So we stood there in Union Square, and I had my sign over my head, and I'm calling out, "Free hugs! Free hugs!" And I waited. And I waited. "Free hugs!" And I waited. And I waited. And someone approached me and said, "Free hugs? Why?" And innocently, I smiled bigger and held my sign even higher, and I said, "Just because hugs make people feel better." And he went, right. And he walked away. And I realized maybe not everyone wants a free hug, but I didn't give up. I continued to stand there with my sign overhead, a smile on my face, and I was patient. Free hugs. They feel good. Come on, who wants a free hug? And someone finally approached, and they said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "Well, today the reason we're doing it is because there's a young man, and tragically he just died. He drowned in the Pacific Ocean, and he has this really wonderful photography project, and we thought hugging people would be a great way to honor him on the day of his funeral." "Oh my gosh, oh that's beautiful," she said, and hugged me. And then once one hug happened, it was like the floodgates opened. People just started coming from all over Union Square. And at one point, we actually had lines of people waiting to hug us. I was hooked. I started organizing my own free hugs events all over New York City. Now, I usually did it in Union Square because that's a gathering place. It's a place where artists meet. There's a farmer's market all through the spring, summer, and fall, and it's where the protesters go too. I've free hugged my fair share of protesters. I'll just walk up and say, "All you need is a hug," and often they'll laugh and they'll say, "Yeah, actually that would feel really good," and I hug the protesters. Some of my favorite hugs are on Valentine's Day. Yeah, I heard that groan in the audience. That was me. Until 2009, I never met a Valentine's Day I liked. If you were in a relationship, there was pressure. Do you cook a fancy dinner? Do you go out to dinner? Do you buy the flowery card or the comedic card? Do you do something really romantic? The pressure. Do you buy those roses totally overpriced? And then when you weren't in a relationship, oh my gosh, depressing. So Valentine's Day 2009, I invited about a dozen friends. We went to Union Square and we free hugged, and it was phenomenal. We hugged hundreds of people that afternoon, hundreds of them. And then for the first time in my life, I loved Valentine's Day. And every Valentine's Day ever since then, I do free hugs no matter where it is I happen to be. I'm usually in Union Square in New York City, and the really fun part is there are people who come every Valentine's Day for their annual free hug. It's great. I started recognizing everyone. Really wonderful. I'll be honest though, sometimes people really wonder what we're doing. Do you have some sort of agenda? What's the catch? What's behind all this free hug stuff? And I explained that it's really about connecting. We are desperate to connect, one to another, heart to heart. That's what it's all about. And often, even the most cynical person, if they don't hug, they at least smile. One of these people happened to be a man in a 3-piece, very expensive business suit. He was kind of watching us on the periphery, and he walked by one time and he just shook his head. And then he walked by a few minutes later and he approached me. He said, "So what's this free hug stuff all about?" I said, "It's just hugs. It's simply a hug to connect, to feel better. It makes me feel better, and other people tell me it makes them feel better too." Uh-huh. He wasn't convinced either. He walked away one more time, but I noticed he didn't leave. He continued to watch. He watched as other people hugged and then walked away with smiles on their faces. He watched as some people seemed to have tears in their eyes. He came back a third time. He approached and he kind of gestured for me to come a little closer. "Listen, I'm stepping way out of my comfort zone right now, but I gotta tell you, I could really use a hug right now." I said, "Well, sure, come here." And so I opened my arms and he stepped a little closer, and it was kind of like hugging cardboard at first. And then he took a deep breath, he sighed, and then he softened. And his arms wrapped a little bit tighter around me, and he whispered in my ear, "I really needed this. I just lost my job on Wall Street today. I don't know how I'm going to tell my wife." I hugged him tighter, waited until he was ready to let go, and then he did. He stepped back and said, "Thanks. You know what? I feel just a little bit better right now." And he smiled as he walked away. There is one young man I will never forget. He approached with great shyness. He looked at me with skepticism and then asked, "Do you hug people like me?" "Like you?" I inquired, thinking perhaps he meant because of the color of his skin or because he was a teenager. "Yeah, like me. Homeless." I smiled at him and opened my arms a little wider. "I hug everyone. Come here." I hugged him and he melted into me. He hugged me tighter. I hugged him tighter. And then he stepped back. "Thanks, that felt good." He walked away, and a few minutes later he returned. "Can someone like me do free hugs?" I giggled. "You mean a teenager?" His smile widened. I handed him a sign. I learned to always carry extras because almost every time someone wants to join us and hug. He stood there with that sign over his head, a huge smile on his face, and oh, how he hugged people. And then I noticed something. He was approaching very specific people. And after a short while, I realized he was hugging all of the homeless in Union Square. If you visit New York City, you may see him, Union Square or in Times Square. He always has his free hug sign with him. I believe he's found his calling. And from what I understand, he isn't homeless anymore. Realizing the deep impact of free hugs, I started to carry my sign everywhere, and I mean everywhere. And I carried my sign to every city I visited, no matter where I happened to be. My favorite cities to free hug in the United States are New York and New Orleans. I carried my free hugs when I did a storytelling tour in Europe, and a free hug in Madrid and Valencia, in Paris, in Rome, Berlin. I took my sign to Central America, to the airport in Belize. Those were some interesting free hugs. I stood with the taxi drivers who all had their Mr. Smith and their Mr. Jones, and I stood there with them. Free hugs! Free hugs! People were a little bit confused, but I actually did get a few hugs. The most unusual and most magical place I've ever done free hugs was the top of Mountain Machu Picchu in Peru. That's free hugs at 12,000 feet. Okay, it's really 10,000, but who's counting? I hiked to the top of Mountain Machu Picchu solo, 2 hours up, arriving at the pinnacle just as full sunrise occurred. and to my left were the snow-capped Andes Mountains, and down below, the ancient Incan city of Machu Picchu, every bit as magical as everyone said it was going to be. And standing there, alone, above cloud cover, I soaked it in. And then I thought to myself, no one is ever going to expect free hugs here. I took out my free hug sign and I stood at the final ascent, and I waited. It wasn't long before other people began to arrive. Free hugs! Congratulations, you made it to the top. You want a hug? And usually they did. I hugged people from Ecuador, Colombia, from Peru, from Mexico, the United States, 2 guys from Australia. One of them, "You sure you want to hug me? I just did the entire hike for 4 days. I'm really sweaty." I said, "Bring it on." And people smiled and they said, "You know, reaching the top, that was fantastic. And this free hug, that was just an extra added bonus." For those who speak Spanish, yes, my sign is bilingual. The people loved the free hugs. The llamas, not so much. Free hugs have a superpower. The other week, talking about free hugs, it dawned on me. It's kind of like Wonder Woman's lasso of truth. Wonder Woman would take the lasso of truth and she would put it around someone and they would tell her their truth. The embrace of a free hug is a lot like that. In hugging someone, there is a trust that just seems to happen, and they feel comfortable in that moment, and people share the most intimate details of their lives. I just lost my job today. I don't know how I'm going to tell my wife. My husband died a few weeks ago. I'm so lonely. Even in this city of 8 million people, I just feel so alone. Do you hug people like me? Homeless? Yeah, I hug everyone. The most powerful free hug I ever received was in Paris. Standing in front of Notre Dame, free hugging with a group of friends, and there was a little boy on the sidewalk. He was rapidly rubbing his hand back and forth across the pavement, and he saw us out of the corner of his eye. He asked his mother what we were doing. To our relief, she did not say we were crazy. She said, "They're hugging people. It's really kind of nice." And then they left. A few moments later, I heard the pitter-patter of little feet on the pavement. That little boy leaped up into my arms, wrapping his arms around me tight, laughing, looking me right in the eye. And then I noticed his mother. She was standing behind, and there were tears just streaming down her face. I gently set the little boy down, and I approached her, apologizing. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Did I do something wrong?" "No, I just can't believe what I just saw. He's severely autistic. He hardly ever hugs me or his father. And to look someone straight in the eye? Never. He hugged you, a complete stranger." She wrapped her arms around me, hugging me close, and she whispered into my ear, "You are special." I hugged her tighter, and I said, "So are you. So are you."
And that was Free Hugs at 12,000 Feet from Kristin Pedemonti off her CD Superhero 101, which if you were to go to storytellerkp.com, her website, I'm sure you'd be able to order a copy of that from her. But you are listening to the Bothy Storytelling Podcast today. I'm Calum, Lykan, and we're having a conversation with Kristin Pedemonti. So the next bit I would love to play for you just blew me away. The bravery of this woman, just the whole idea behind it. After disaster, she forged onwards and just created this amazing concept from it. And this is all about a wee trip to Belize and what came from that. So again, here is Kristin Pedemonti having a wee chat about some of her projects.
So I sold my house and all my stuff 2005 and
I
started
saw
this
that.
literacy
Yeah.
project.
I was reading your bio and I was just like, wow, what a brave
It
thing.
was, wait, I don't know. You know what it was? It wasn't even brave. It was like not knowing. Like, I just, yeah, sure, I'll try this. Like, what's the worst that could happen? And so, had quit, left my full-time job, was newly divorced, and went on a holiday to just go away. And I ended up in Belize, in Central America, as one of the ports of call, and met this young snorkel instructor who was Belizean, who said, "Oh my God, a storyteller! I've never met a storyteller before." We start chatting. "Do you know about the literacy problem here?" "Oh no, I had no idea." "Oh my gosh, I think you could do something about it." "What? Why do you think that?" He said, "Well, you're filled with enthusiasm. You have this experience working in libraries, and you like connecting kids with books." And so it was really, he planted the idea and the spark. And then when I came home, that was in the summer, so he and I wrote to each other all summer, and he said, "Come down to Belize for your birthday in September, and we'll have a great time, and we'll make sure your project gets started." I said, "All right." So he convinced his former high school to have me come in for a day and do storytelling and poetry workshops with the high school students.
Brilliant.
And it was called Where I Am From. It was based on a George Ella Lyons poem, and it's a sensory poem. So every line of the poem is "I am from," and then you go through the senses. But instead of just superficially going through sight, it's really tapping further into, I'm from the lines were like, "I'm from the palm fronds gently waving in the Caribbean sea breeze," things like that. "I'm from the smell of tortillas frying in the pan on our charcoal pit," whatever. So anyway, the students really resonated, and I was hooked. Like right from then, it's all right. What can I do?
Yeah.
And so that's when I came home, stuck the sale sign in the yard, and the house sold. It sold actually before the sign was even in the yard. The realtor called and said, "I know the sign's going in your yard tomorrow. We've got the single father with 5 kids." And I put another thing out saying, "I want a family to move into this house."
Yeah.
And so it sold, and closing was 17 days later. So it happened really quick. And then my mom's house was my base, and then I flew back and forth.
Excellent.
Down to Belize every couple of, I would go for 2 weeks to 6 weeks at a time and listen. It's a lot of listening in the beginning to find out what do people really need. Because often I see in projects, and this is where a lot of the learning happened, I saw a lot of people coming in and doing what they thought was needed, but not really asking the locals what they needed.
Yeah.
And so there was a disconnect. And then I would hear stories about, these people come in and they think they know what they're doing. They never listen to us. They treat us like children. Well, and through that project, first of all, through the listening, found out, okay, they needed materials because not a single new bookstore in the country at that time, it was 2005. And then they needed training because at that time you could have 10 days of training and you could become a teacher after 10 days of training.
10 days?
10 days. Yeah, that's it. And not only that, you'd have 40 kids in your classroom, all different abilities, you'd have no support, and you've got 10 days of training. It's like, okay, good luck. I have so much respect because I don't even know how they did what they did. So the project evolved, and in the beginning it was doing book drives to bring in specific materials that they requested, so specific books they could use, reflecting their culture, reflecting rainforest and the coral reef and things like that.
Yeah.
And then it was the realization from them they needed training. For the training was developing 10 activities per book, so they had a whole alphabet set of 26 books, every letter of the alphabet, and then 10 activities per book in a little simple manual, and then I would do teacher training. So they would come in, I'd show them how to use the materials, and then gift them a set of books for the school. And then so I'd go to all these villages with sets of books, do the training.
That's fantastic.
It was amazing. And then what happened, so the next evolution of the project was, as I'm traveling to all these villages, I would hear their indigenous stories. I'd hear their cultural stories.
So you're collecting as well.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
So what happened then was the stories were banned from a lot of the schools because they were considered, many of the schools in Belize are religiously run schools. And the tales were looked at as heretical because they were things like Tata Duende, the protector of the rainforest. They're spirits. And the locals really look at these as real. these are real beings that interact with you. It's, in a way, it reminds me of some of the fairy culture, like the deeper fairy culture. And there was a lot of disrespect for these stories from outsiders, either from a religious view of, oh, this is dangerous, this is satanic, this is heresy, or there were things, I think, that other view of there's a lot of power in these stories. So how do you take someone's power? You take their stories and you take their language. And that's kind of what happened in a way. And so as I was learning the stories and then having conversations with teachers and administrators, it's like, wouldn't it be amazing if we use these in the schools? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Well, I'm a rebel. And honestly, some of that, I didn't even know they were banned until later. It was first using them for like 4 years, almost 5 years, until someone said, I was like, it's weird that I never see these in the school. They're so powerful. And then they told me why. I was oh, wow. And then, so what happened was I asked another, so what do you need now? So we did the materials, and then they said, well, the students, they take a national exam in order to have the potential of going to high school, entering high school. And on this exam, there's creative writing, and it's not in the primary school curriculum. So the teachers aren't taught how to teach it, and it's not even part of the curriculum, but it's part of this national exam. So it was setting them up for failure. Like completely, yeah. So at that time, again, this is back 2000, this is now like 2006. It's like a year into the project. The teachers would tell me that only 60% of the students would pass the national exam and even be able to go to high school. And of that 60%, at that time, something like only 30% graduated, which is abysmal. Because again, the primary curriculum, to give you an example of how, so everything was memorization by rote. The teacher would write everything on the blackboard. The students would copy it down in their notebooks, or God love the teacher, for the younger grades, they'd write, all these kids would have little notebooks. The teacher would write everything in, have a little blank for the kid to fill in or something to circle. So half the kids didn't know how to read. They were just guessing, circling things or copying something from a
shape
list.
Association almost.
Yeah, sure. And so that set them up. And they weren't constructing their own sentences. No critical thinking, because you're just circling true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blank. And then they go to high school and it's all essay writing. It's just they're not at all prepared.
Yeah.
And so the failure rate, as they were telling me this, I said, well, what if we do a creative writing and we use your cultural stories? So the framework was that we would do a brainstorming discussion where I focused on 5 of the tales. So there's Tata Duende, Protector of the Rainforest, La Llorona, the Crying Woman, which is actually Mexican, but it's all throughout Central America. And then there was Ishtabai, who is a shapeshifter. There's El Cadejo, who is a shape-shifting dog, and there's an evil one and a good one. And then for a while we did Anansi, the spider. But those were so well known that I actually pulled that out because that was in the schools for some reason. That one was okay. But I think because it's very obvious that Anansi is made up. Right?
Yeah.
Where the other ones were based on something that really happened. And then that freaked people out. And the Anansi stories, so that African piece was from the Garifuna, that culture it was part of Nigeria, and they're the only slaves who were meant to be slaves who were never enslaved. They actually shipwrecked on St. Vincent Island, and from there they made their way to Central America, and they're a very proud culture. And then that's where the Anansi stories kind of were brought with that. So there's that richness too, like you put all those layers of culture, and then using those stories. So we would sit and have a brainstorm, and the kids often had heard from somebody, whether that was an auntie or a grandma or a great-grandma, something about one of these figures. So we would do, what did you hear? What did you hear? And then they're sharing their details, and they would get so excited because they're like, Miss, you care about like these stories? Yeah, don't you? It's so cool that you care. Like they were just blown away that somebody would care about it. And then it was a first-person narrative. So after we brainstormed, they would choose one of those characters. And it was what would happen if you met them face to face. face-to-face describe. So they're using action words, they're using descriptive language, they're looking at past tense. So there were all these grammar things that were happening that they're not even aware of because they're having so much fun writing.
Yeah.
And we would talk about similes and metaphors and, strong verbs rather than walk. How can you describe that more specifically? Did they saunter? Did they slither? So it was really fun, and that ended up being, and I didn't bring a copy, it ended up being A Bridge of Story, which is the book about the Belize project. So in that book, it's the outline of the creation of the project, having no idea what I was doing, and the idea behind sharing that process
Lovely.
is to say, hey, if you have an idea, here's some obstacles that became opportunities. Here are some challenges faced, and this is kind of how this was my path navigating. Maybe your path will be different, but these are some things that might come up for you too. And to encourage people that you don't have to know exactly what you're doing. I think if you go into it with what can I learn from the locals first, that's key to me. Mm-hmm. Value the people you are serving, that's first. Really honor and value. And then it's listen. And then it's create what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And always be willing to be flexible and adapt what you're doing to the needs of the people. If you do something and 6 months later they say, well, I don't know if that's really what we need. Cool, let's shift it. What do you need?
Yeah.
And so that project ended up taking me to Ghana. A librarian in Accra Googled storytelling and literacy. My website popped up. They called me on Skype. I thought it was a joke until they showed me the library behind them. They're like, this is a staff member. It's really, and it took 2 years to get there, and I took the project there.
Amazing.
And then I went to Kenya, and that was for a storytelling festival. Actually, Kenya was first. Ghana was like 4 months later. And then I did the same thing in Haiti. And that's a very long circle.
Yeah. Isn't she just amazing? Just the fact that she sold everything and just kept forging on to make this happen. Complete respect and such bravery that she has. So I'd like to follow that up with a fun little story from her CD, Superhero 101. And this one is Bubbles on the Subway.
Share joy with others, and you release joy within yourself. I believe the reverse is true as well. Share your own joy, and you can release joy in people around you. So some people have imaginary friends. I take imaginary journeys. And this evening, we're going to go on an imaginary journey together, a journey toward joy. And together, we're going to go on the New York City subway. Now, I'm aware you're probably thinking, especially if you've ever been on the New York City subway, Kristin, that is one of the last places we are going to find any joy. But if you humor me for a minute, and if you come along with me, you might be surprised. I'm going to ask you all, if you're willing, to close your eyes for a moment. I'd like to set the scene for you. We are on the New York City subway, and it's rush hour. The car is packed with people, and yet no one interacts with anyone. They stare at the ads overhead or a New York Times crumbled in their lap. They stare at their shoes, anything but interact. There's a young mother and her child is crying, and no one helps her. And then Mike stands up and begins to speak loudly. Hey man, I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Mike, and I lost my job, and my wife just left me. I'm homeless, man. It's gotten really bad. Even the dog ran away. I'm hungry. I'm just looking for a little bit of loose change. Anything you can spare, man. I just want to put a little food in my belly. People turn their MP3 players louder, and no one pays attention to him. And then I reach into my bag, and I pull out a bottle of bubbles, because I'm always packing. You can open your eyes. And I begin to blow those bubbles. Now, when I tell you I'm always packing, I mean I'm always packing. I've been carrying bubbles with me since 1994. I started carrying bubbles with me when I worked in cancer research, ovarian cancer, at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And I used to do a grueling commute from Pennsburg, Pennsylvania, down to Philly on the Schuylkill Expressway. We dubbed it the Schuylkill, and other times we called it the parking lot, because a 45-minute commute often turned into 2 hours. And even I would become frustrated. There were times when I made some sign language gestures I am not particularly proud of. And I decided that I needed to create my very own stress reduction kit. Now, everyone's stress reduction kit is probably going to be a little bit different. In mine were soothing tunes. For me, that means the greatest hits from Sesame Street. And I had bubbles. I would roll down the windows of my car and I would blow bubbles out. Oh, and it made me feel better. And then I noticed it seemed to make people in the cars around me feel better too, because sometimes they'd roll their windows down and they would shout over to me, "Hey, excuse me, could you blow some bubbles in here?" And I would. So I learned to carry them with me all the time. We're back on that New York City subway, and I've just reached into my bag and I've pulled out a bottle of bubbles, because as I said, I'm always packing, and I begin to blow. And of course, since it's New York City, people act like they don't see anything. But I notice someone smiling, and that crying child has stopped crying. So I reach into my bag, and I hand out a bottle of bubbles to the young mother, and I gesture for her to join me. And she opens her bubbles, and she starts to blow them too. And then other people start to smile. I reach into my bag and I hand out another bottle of bubbles and I gesture for them to join me. And they do. And I reach into my bag and I hand out another bottle of bubbles. And I share and I gesture for them to join me. And they do. I've handed out over 500 bottles of bubbles on the New York City subways. And those bubbles, they hold some sort of superpower. They make people smile. They change the energy in the subway. They make people feel better. People start talking to each other. People are laughing. Bubbles hold superpower. So I ask you to maybe carry some bubbles with yourself, because you never know when you just might need a little bit of superpower.
Fabulous from Kristin Pedemonti. Bubbles on the subway from her Superhero 101 CD. But at this point in the show, I'd like to step away from Kristin for a moment, and I'd like to put a shout out to another podcast that exists out there. The wonderful Kat Ward, a good friend of mine, has just set up a brand new podcast, Paranormal Heart. It's based around her experiences working within the paranormal community, and what she's doing is asking people to phone in and tell the tale of their encounters. Absolutely wonderful listening. And if you've ever worked in any of the paranormal events, myself, I used to do walking tours, ghost tours in Edinburgh, and we had lots of people encounter weird and wonderful happenings. So if you enjoy listening to some interesting real-life supernatural experiences, head over to Paranormal Heart with Kat Ward as your host and enjoy that brand new podcast, only in its second or third episode and going strong with listeners. So do sit back and enjoy that one as well. So not only is Kristin an absolute firecracker, getting out there in the world, doing these amazing projects, traveling and storytelling all over. I believe she's in, don't quote me on this, I think she's in Fuji at the moment. That might be wrong. She's somewhere exotic, I know that. The last I heard, she was somewhere exotic. But she's also setting up this amazing online project, We Become the Stories We Tell. I've actually got the card in front of me, so I'm just going to read directly off it. Ask yourself, are the stories and experiences you consume, share and tell serving you and others? Are you aware of the role you place yourself in? Is it time to reframe and retell? Kristin Pedemonti, cause-focused storyteller, speaker, coach, can teach you how to be aware, choose wisely, reframe, retell, and become the author of your own story. Love that expression. so you can avoid burnout, better serve, communicate, connect, be compassionate, empower, and understand yourself and others. So keep a lookout for that. Again, that should be on her website, storytellerkp.com. We become the stories we tell. I believe it's going to take the form of an online sort of course system. So just keep your eye out for that. That should be a fantastic thing coming from Kristin. Now, with the chat with Kristin, it was stories, 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 stories. It was a fabulous 3 hours. And as I said, we didn't even touch the tip of the iceberg in this one. This was an amazing time. And we talked about various books and influences, and we chatted about stories. And it came to me that Calum's book recommendation, yes, I'm actually going to try and do this as a regular thing. I should probably create a jazzy little intro to it. I don't know, I'll work on that one. But I decided, yes, I'm going to do another book recommendation on the back of the chat with Kristin. And this week's book recommendation from Calum Lykan is Jim Henson's The Storyteller. One of my favourite books, one of my favourite TV shows again. Actually, it was one of the influences for storytelling for me. If you've never, ever seen it, Jim Henson did this amazing production called The Storyteller with John Hurt as the actual storyteller. It was a blend of the Creature Workshop, shadow puppetry, real life acting. It was just this gorgeous blend of all these folk and fairy tales from around the world. It's also been brought out in a beautiful book, Jim Henson's The Storyteller, the novelization, written by Anthony I'm going to mispronounce this again. I always do this. Minghella, with illustrations from Hannah Christensen and Eva Eskalinen. Now, this book is wonderful. Again, you could probably pick this up in Canada at any chapters, in the UK at Waterstones. And again, you know what? I really need to research bookshops in America, folks. I've no idea where you can get books down there. But this is a cracking little book filled with wonderful stories. Some of my favourites, obviously, Three Ravens is in there, The Heartless Giant, Fear Not, but my favourite, The Soldier and Death, a wonderful tale from Russia. So that is my recommendation for the book this week. Get out there and buy Jim Henson's The Storyteller. If you're listening in Canada, head down to your local chapters. This is where I got mine, and I love it. Beautiful illustrations, wonderful stories, and a great inspiration for anybody wishing to tell stories or get into storytelling. My conversation with Kristin was amazing. We just spent a few hours chatting, and it was so lovely. She really is just this glorious woman with so much passion for storytelling and energy to meet people. And I thought that maybe after hearing from her and all her wonderful stories and everything she gave me through that conversation, I would like to give her a gift back. And I thought long and hard about a wee story to tell today for Kristin. And I came up with one which I remember telling a while back called The Most Beautiful Heart. And I think this sums up everybody's life. But for Kristin, you know, she's brave. She puts her heart out there every single day. So this I'm dedicating to her. I believe it's a wee story from India, and it's called The Most Beautiful Heart. One day, a young man was standing in the middle of the town, proclaiming that he had the most beautiful heart in the whole valley. A large crowd gathered, and they all admired his heart, for it was perfect. There was not a mark on it, nor a flaw in it. Yes, they all agreed it truly was the most beautiful heart they had ever seen. And the young man stood very proud and boasted more loudly about his beautiful heart. Suddenly, an old man appeared at the front of the crowd and said, "Why, your heart is not nearly as beautiful as mine." The crowd and the young man looked at the old man's heart. Yes, it was beating strongly, but it was full of scars. It had places where pieces had been removed and other pieces put in. But they didn't quite fit right, and there were several jagged edges. In fact, some of the places, there were deep gouges where whole pieces were missing. The people stared. How can he say his heart is more beautiful? The young man looked at the old man's heart and saw its state and laughed. You must be joking, he said. Compare your heart with mine. Mine is perfect, and yours is a mess of scars and tears. Yes, said the old man. Yours is perfect looking, but I would never trade with you. You see, every scar represents a person to whom I have given my love. I tear out a piece of my heart and give it to them, and often they give me a piece of their heart, which fits into the empty place. But because the pieces aren't exact, I have some rough edges, which I cherish because they remind me of the love we shared. Sometimes I've given a piece of my heart away and the other person hasn't returned it. These are the empty gouges. Giving love is taking a chance. Although these gouges are painful, they stay open, reminding me of the love I have for those people too. And I hope that someday they may return and fill the space I have waiting. So now, do you see what true beauty is? The young man stood silently, with tears running down his cheeks. He walked up to the old man and reached into his perfect young and beautiful heart and ripped a piece out. He offered it to the old man with trembling hands. The old man took his offering, placed it in his heart, and then took a piece of his old scarred heart and placed it in the wound in the young man's heart. It fit, but not perfectly, as there were some jagged edges. The young man looked at his heart, not perfect anymore, but more beautiful than ever, since the love from the old man's heart flowed into his. They embraced and walked away side by side. And that was The Most Beautiful Heart, and that is dedicated to Kristin Pedemonti, for she truly gives her heart wherever she goes. And with that, ladies and gents, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. I want to thank you all for joining me on this little journey and a conversation with Kristin Pedemonti. Our next episode is going to be all about burns. And I don't mean those nasty things that you get when you accidentally spill hot water on your lap. I'm talking about Robert Burns, the Bard of Scotland. So the next episode, we're hoping to have a few nice pieces of Rabbie Burns's poems. We're going to have a little bit of a talk about Burns, and it's all going to be about Burns Day. So get your kilts on, get your haggis out, get the whiskey tasting going, and prepare for some good old Burns. But to finish off this episode, I'm going to leave you with the words of Kristin Pedemonti. Thank you, enjoy, and I'll see you all the next time.
Superhero 101. We all have the ability to be everyday superheroes. Every day we do things that may seem small and insignificant to us, but make a deeper impact than what we may ever realize. I encourage you to release your inner superhero and have fun doing it.